Hi, I'm David Lee Simmons, entertainment reporter for NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. We're really excited about the release of our 2014 bar guide, which this year includes a look at our picks for the best 50 bars around New Orleans. But more for the purposes of our discussion, this guide features our first ever top 10 bars of New Orleans, which came after a lot of discussion and a lot of debate with our entertainment staff. Some of them are obviously here with me today. Todd Price, restaurant writer and longtime drinks writer. Brett Anderson, who's off camera right now, a restaurant critic and features writer. And of course, Laura McKnight, our main drinks writer. First, we should probably discuss the methodology that went into picking our 10 best, in which we had to decide what made a great New Orleans bar. And that list features Arnaud's French 75, Avenue Pub, Bacchanal, Barley Oak, Cure, Aaron Rose, Mimi's in the Marigny, The Saint, the Sazerac Bar, and 12 Mile Limit. So let's talk a little bit about the methodology and the parameters that we kind of employed deciding on how to do this. And we really are kind of asking a question, what makes a great New Orleans bar? But also, we see here a top 10 that in many ways, each of these bars has a story to tell. And in combining those 10, kind of tells a little bit of a story about the New Orleans drinking scene. And Brett, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. We knew, of course, what we didn't want. We knew that we didn't want to have bars where live music was a predominant feature, or drinking, or a restaurant or an eating was a predominant feature, or dancing. We didn't want dance clubs. We didn't want live music venues per se. We didn't want restaurant bars. How does that play into what we did want?
Well, I think a big reason that we had to narrow this focus down, and in your introduction, I believe you called it to debate. I might more accurately call it argument.
Yes.
We would still be in that conference room talking about what bars are supposed to be on this list if we started talking about music clubs and we started talking about dance clubs, because New Orleans is, of course, an incredibly rich environment for doing these things for late night, for nightlife. Where it comes to restaurants, I think in some ways we had to cut them out for that very reason, is we needed to focus this down, and we needed to focus this on where are the places that people can go in New Orleans specifically to indulge in the pleasure of drinking and wasting time. And I really think that these places, this top 10, does sort of embody that spirit. One thing I'll say about restaurants is that up until about, I'd say 10 years ago now, maybe even more recently, restaurants really were where we saw a lot of the action with creative cocktails and with wine in particular. If you really wanted to drink good wine and drink a good cocktail for a lot of years, up until I'd say 2004 through 2006, that's where you had to go. But we do address restaurants every year in the dining guide. And this list and this guide itself is really just about drinking. And I think by eliminating those other places, that's what we get.
Laura, in particular, in our discussions, you made a pretty impassioned plea to include 12 Mile Limit, and the more we talked about it, the more we kind of saw this as a bar that seemed so representative of a lot of the things that make a great New Orleans bar. It almost seemed like it served a lot of different needs. Talk a little bit about why 12 Mile Limit is such a great New Orleans bar.
I think it is one of the few, and maybe the only bar in New Orleans that has a combination of sort of a traditional neighborhood bar, mid-city bar, kind of a grittier aspect, and also like trivia nights, free food on Mondays, all these sort of community activities that bring people into the bar and get to know their neighbors, while also bringing in craft beer and, more importantly, I guess to some, is craft cocktails. It reflects like all the current trends of, in craft cocktails in the city, but in this environment that's very comfortable to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I've always been a fan of making things accessible to people. I think some people might be a little intimidated to go into Cure, or maybe that's something they do on a special occasion, whereas 12 Mile Limit might be a place they feel more comfortable grabbing a drink with friends after work, participating in trivia night, and at the same time having a great cocktail, which is a unique mix, I think.
We have a lot of lists by category of best neighborhood bar, best wine bar, best cocktail bar. So if it's on the top 10, it's not going to be in that top 5. Brett, talk a little bit about one bar in particular that is an interesting inclusion, like Bacchanal, for example. What makes that a great inclusion in the top 10, but also we have places that serves food, it serves live music?
I think Bacchanal it's one of those that I sort of expected we're going to have to defend quite stringently, because it's, they do serve food, they do have live music. And by the way, it's a retail store. Is this place a bar? And I think that it's embodies a certain type of business in New Orleans and across the country that is influenced by every other aspect of going out. It is strongly influenced by restaurants. It is strongly influenced by cocktail movements, and it's also strongly influenced by the sort of anything goes New Orleans ethos. I mean, for years, it's no secret, they weren't exactly up to code. Which is a very New Orleans impulse, correct? And
impulse
it's also
is a nice way to put it.
Yeah, and when you go there on, particularly on a weekend night, everyone in there, whether they're listening to music or eating or drinking or what have you, is practicing, the art of wasting time in a way that I think is very New Orleans and, says something about the city. It speaks to the narrative you're talking about.
We have on this list bars that have opened within the last few years. We have bars that have been around for a little while and then have kind of changed their character a little bit. Todd, I was wondering, as somebody who's covered the cocktail scene as long as you have, there are some bars in particular that really excel at a time when the national trend is also to embrace the craft cocktail.
Yeah, I mean, I think Cure is the one that leaps out. It's kind of the place you can go for a great cocktail in New Orleans, and I think it kind of changed completely how cocktails, the cocktail scene in New Orleans. Before Cure opened, the common refrain was there were bartenders doing great cocktails, but you had to know when they were working, you had to be there at their shift. Cure was kind of the first bar where you knew you walked in, no matter who was back there, you're going to get a great, well-made drink. Now, there's a lot more of those now. And I think another one that kind of shows some evolution is Arnaud's French 75. I mean, before Cure opened, that was the prime example of when Chris McMillan's working.
Chris Hanna,
excuse me. Oh my goodness.
Sorry, Chris.
Oh man, I knew that was wrong. Another great bartender, but he's at
Apologies
Kingfish.
to all
Yes.
Chris
When Chris
involved.
Hanna was working, you knew you'd get a great drink. But otherwise, maybe not so much. But that's changed. I mean, they have come along certainly because Chris Hanna has pushed them and has quite the national reputation himself. But I mean, you walk in there now and you'll get a solid drink. So I think it represents, a great illustration of how standards have kind of pushed, and a lot of places that maybe were a little lackadaisical with their drinks are taken a lot more seriously.
One of the things that I like about this list, and it does diverge slightly from the dining guide, the top 10 restaurants. We had a really robust debate about this, an argument, if you will, and that was, the top 10 restaurants is kind of a fine dining list. You think of white tablecloth on the table, whereas there was a pretty impassioned plea to get in bars that are grittier. The Saint is kind of like Snake and Jake, kind of that iconic dive bar, even though it hasn't been around nearly as long as Snake and Jake's, but it really is a flashpoint. It has so much character that people want to go there. You look at Aaron Rose, Mimi's and the Marigny, these are not fancy bars. 12 Mile Limit, not a fancy bar, but it serves so many needs. And that's one of the things that spoke to me, because I was initially resistant to that. But when you look at this 10 and you see their inclusion alongside Arnaud's French 75 and the Sazerac Bar, which is just such a classy joint, it really does show how much this is a great drinking town, but one with quality and one with character. I think that's something that we should be really happy about with this. But to that end, there will be plenty of discussion. Any final thoughts about the list and the guide itself?
This is Todd. I think we also made sure every single one of these 10 you could walk in and get a good drink. Even if they were gritty, these are places you still can walk in and be assured of getting a great drink.
Compared to the dining guide, even though we did have to narrow down what our definition of a bar was for this is actually a fleshier narrative. Because with the dining guide, you just have white tablecloths. This one, you do have the gritty places. It would be, while I still think the dining guide tells a story, I think this one tells a sort of a fuller story of New Orleans because you have those neighborhood bars and the dive bars in it.